call Chris Farfoy.
Speaker, thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to the third reading of the Standards and Accreditation Bill, and I want to acknowledge the Minister and his remarks. There are some issues that he raised that on this side of the House that we would agree with, but in essence, since the Select Committee process, we have had major concerns with how this piece of legislation has progressed. There was an issue to fix here, Mr Speaker, and it was, as the Minister pointed out, around the financial viability of our standards process. And I think there's no doubt that we agreed and that the government has taken action to try and address that. But in this piece of legislation, we believe the government has tried to address that, hasn't addressed that, but has created a completely and new issue around the independence of our standards setting process. And concerns were raised not just from the opposition, but more importantly in this case, I believe, Mr Speaker, from a number of submitters to the Select Committee process who have had decades of experience in this field, and I will go to that a little bit later in my contribution. I think this is an example, though, because of the government's inability to listen to some of those concerns, where the government has looked a little bit out of touch with what the industry, certainly and those experts in this field, have been calling for. And we supported this piece of legislation at its first reading because we wanted it to go to Select Committee to hear those concerns, and we expressed concerns around the independence of the standard setting body then. And we thought and hoped that the concerns raised by us, by submitters, and being able to get some more scrutiny from officials during the Select Committee process, that the government might see that it was worth listening to some of those concerns. But unfortunately, in this case, the government ploughed on and the concerns of the opposition and the stakeholders weren't listened to. And we believe while the Select Committee did change this piece of legislation for some better, it still has some fundamental issues that we don't believe have been addressed. We don't believe, as I've said earlier, that the issues around the financial viability of the process have been addressed, and certainly we don't believe that the government has made a positive move by putting the standards body that used to be independent and standalone within the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. So we do continue to have concerns around that. A lot of concern was raised around the independence issue, around our international reputation, Mr Speaker, and I believe the Minister raised that towards the end of his speech and said he was confident that New Zealand's international reputation around here, and a very good reputation there, an excellent one, as we heard through the Select Committee process, would stay intact. Unfortunately, that's not what many of the submitters who have been in this sector for decades said, and I do want to take the House to some verbatim quotes from the Select Committee submitters. One from a member of the Joint New Zealand-Australia Committee on Standards since 1995, so a couple of decades experience shouldn't be scoffed at, by the name of Diane Bagley, said she opposed the disestablishment, and if I can read this from the submission, Mr Speaker, said she opposed the disestablishment of the Standards Council and Standards New Zealand. She did not consider that the provisions set out for the establishment of the standards function within MB can adequately control the risks associated with the new structure, whether to the management of the standards development process or the reputation of New Zealand in the international standards community. So she was speaking directly to that international reputation. She went on to say the model proposed in the bill, if realised, and this is what this third reading will do, might even be used as an example by countries without the robust government systems with undesirable results. She went on to say that New Zealand is the example being that New Zealand is a well-respected country in the international standards community, and if the argument was that New Zealand does it from less reputable nations, if New Zealand does it this way, then we should do it this way too. Mr. Speaker, also another experienced person in the sector by the name of Patricia Cuniff, and I think, if I remember from memory, she made the submission on New Year's Day. So, you know, someone who could have been out there having a summer holiday, but felt so passionately about this issue, decided on New Year's Day to send a submission on the Standards and Accreditation Bill to the Commerce Select Committee, which I think is, you know, absolute commitment to the cause. She went on to say, also as a submitter to this Commerce Select Committee, I remain unconvinced that placing New Zealand's national standards body within MB will indeed ensure that the standards system is viable and well-functioning. Now, a matter of 5 minutes ago, Mr. Speaker, our Minister, Paul Goldsmith, said that he was relatively confident of those two things, yet we've got people who are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, who I mentioned made a submission on New Year's Day, completely and utterly disagreeing with the Minister. That was made at the Select Committee process, and those kind of sentiments, Mr. Speaker, I think to the detriment of this piece of legislation, haven't been listened to. I think she went on to say that the bill as it stands now is predicated on consumers being the recipients of standardisation and not participants, and she wanted to make sure that consumers were at the centre of that process. Mr. Speaker, there are other issues that we have with this piece of legislation that we've continued to make in the Select Committee process, second reading, and also at the Select Committee stage. One of them being concerns that were raised by the Council of Trade Unions, and some of our brethren were with us tonight up in our caucus room, talking about not only the long-term financial sustainability of this piece of legislation and whether or not the standards process will be able to be continued as we know it, but also making sure they made a submission to try and make sure there was protections within this piece of legislation for workers. Which is one of the fundamental things that we do, one of the fundamental things that the Council of Trade Union does, and that this side of the House does. But obviously, that was not heeded to in this piece of legislation, which goes to another piece of legislation which was passed earlier this year in this House around the protection of workers in the workplace, not just in the workplace, but also to consumers in the general public. And I think that it's another sad and sorry state of affairs where we can have a piece of legislation come through this piece of legislation come through this House, concerns again raised by people representing workers and the Labour Party, and again ignored in this piece of legislation through the many stages that it could have been taken on board by the government. And that was a concern again by our brothers and sisters at the Council of Trade Unions. Mr. Speaker, the bell has rung, so I believe I've got limited time left. But this was a missed and is a missed opportunity for us to continue to keep our long-standing and excellent international reputation within the standards and accreditation community. But again, it was overlooked and ignored by this government, and I think it's kind of a very early stages of third-term arrogance, where despite people who know better or who have more experience in this field on a day-to-day basis, the government says, no, thank you very much. We know what's best. We're going to ignore what you, the practitioners, believe is best, and we're going to do what we think is best. And it doesn't solve the issue of financial viability around the standards process. In fact, it might make things worse. And it also creates another bigger problem around the independence of our standard setting process, which Patricia Cuniff and Diane Bagley, I think, spoke more eloquently than any of us could about this. It does matter that our international reputation stays intact, and therefore for them it does matter that our standards process is independent of any government influence. And while the Minister can sit and stand or speak on the other side of the House and talk to the confidence that he has about independence and our international reputation, well, I'm sorry, Minister, those at the coalface disagree. And I think this government and that Minister ignores them at their peril.